Hello and welcome to TVOL, where we talk about tactics and their evolution. Today we are going to be focusing on the unexpected tactical flexibility of Ralf Rangnick. We are going to do that in reference to a match played recently between Manchester United and Burnley, which finished 3-1 to Manchester United. Manchester United played in a very different way versus their recent match against Newcastle, for example. We're now going to take a look at some key statistics from the match itself. Man United had more of the ball versus Burnley, 57% versus 43%. They had more frequent and higher quality chances, which is what's measured by expected goals. 2 versus 0.9. Now, Ralf Rangnick is most famous for his approach to pressuring the opposition, and in particular trying to win the ball during transition periods in the opposition's defensive third. This is absolutely not the approach that was taken in this match, which I find to be the most interesting aspect, tactically speaking, of the game here. Man United allowed Burnley to have a lot of the ball. On average, they allowed Burnley to play just over 20 passes before they tried to tackle or otherwise disrupt the opposition. So what we learn from that is that in this match, Manchester United were much more passive, which again reinforces rather the point that Rangnick is much more tactically flexible than we might have expected him to be. If you compare that to Bielsa, who it feels like he would set up his Leeds United side the same, whether he was playing Bolton under 12s or Barcelona, they would play more or less in the same way with the same principles, regardless of who they have available, and again regardless of the opposition. Rangnick seems to be adopting a much more flexible approach. So coming back to the game itself, we can see on the right-hand side that versus Burnley, he wanted to achieve more width. So you saw, for example, Shaw and Sancho having a lot of interaction down the left-hand side, and you can just see clearly there's a lot more width in the approach. On the left-hand side versus Newcastle, with the exception of the fullbacks, Telles and Dalot, in that case, they're much more narrow. The advantage of that narrow formation versus Newcastle is that they're more close together when they are attacking and when they have the ball. What that allows them to do is play shorter passes into feet, have that interchange. Where they lose possession, they have a much more concentrated cluster of players, which allows them to counter-press. Versus Burnley, even though counter-pressing is what Rangnick is most famous for, and in general a high-pressure approach, they were hardly counter-pressing at all, which we'll see in a second when we take a look at some of the pictures from the match itself. So we talked about the principles. Let's now take a look at how that unfolded, looking at some screenshots of the match. First of all, we can see a really clear example of what Manchester United were trying to avoid. They suffered on the transition. They suffered when Newcastle were putting effective counter-attacks together. Towards the beginning of the match, just after 4 minutes, what we have happening here is Sancho losing out at the top end of the pitch, and Burnley are effectively able to counter. They're able to move down the right-hand side. Matic and McTominay are quite close together, but they are relatively square with each other. So flat, and they are bypassed with Lennon picking up the ball towards the right-hand side of the picture. Lennon's then in quite a lot of space between the Manchester United midfield and their defensive back line, which is relatively separated now, and he's going to be able to find his forward on the left-hand side. Which he does, and Manchester United, as they have been noted to have been doing in a lot of recent matches this season, are scrambling back towards their own goal. But the point is that Manchester United's main defensive principle in this match was to remain narrow and compact, and not allow Burnley those spaces to play through. And we're now going to take a look at a couple of examples of that. So Sancho, as you can see highlighted, is in the centre of the field, surrounded by a couple of Burnley players. And what's going to happen is he's going to end up losing the ball. You can see, if you contrast this versus the Newcastle approach, he would have much more players around him in a much more narrow attacking formation, whereas here they were prioritising width. So as said, Sancho loses out on this particular occasion. Burnley are able to then, in a pretty relaxed way, play their ball back to the centre-back on this occasion. What they're then able to do is pick a pass out to the right back. And what the arrow is there for, and the highlight on Sancho, is to make the point that rather than counter press, so as a reminder, this is the idea, that not the idea is when you have the ball, particularly when you're high up the pitch, when you lose it, you immediately try to regain possession. Many times coaches like Guardiola, for example, and many others would impose a time limit. So they would say you need to win the ball back in 5 or 8 seconds or whatever it might be. The alternative, one of the alternatives to that, is to prioritise defensive shape and solidity, which is what is happening in this case. So you can see that Sancho, rather than moving forward towards the ball, is concentrated on getting back into his position from a defensive point of view, which is out on the left-hand side of midfield, to put pressure on the pass, in this case, going into the channel. Now here's another example illustrating the same kind of principle. You have McTominay on the ball. He's going to look to feed Ronaldo, with Wan-Bissaka making an underlapping run towards the left-hand side. Ronaldo misplaces his pass back to McTominay as they try to execute a 1-2. You can see United are relatively spread apart. Again, the point is they're not trying to counter-press or in any case put a huge amount of pressure on the ball. What we're going to see them doing is prioritising getting back into a compact defensive shape, and expect that Burnley would make mistakes and they would regain possession in that way. And that is exactly what they do, unlike where the goal came from, which we'll see in a second, and unlike that counter-attack, which was also led by Lennon, which we saw at the beginning of these series of images. They managed to get 2 layers, so a midfield layer and the defensive layer, in front of where Burnley have possession, and they remain relatively solid and compact. They don't always manage to achieve that, of course, and you could argue that the way in which they conceded the goal scored by Lennon to make it 3-1, their passivity led to a counter-attacking approach. They weren't able to get into the right defensive shape quickly enough, and this, as we'll see, led to the goal. So in this case, Burnley, under very little pressure, are able to play a through ball to Wood, I think it is in this case, the centre forward. And then in the end, the ball is going to break to Lennon. The other key thing that happens here is that Bailly takes a very, very poor touch, which allows the move to progress. But so part of it is about individual errors, as we can see here from Bailly. The ball comes off him. It's just a poor touch. Lennon is able to run into the right hand channel and finish neatly past De Gea, which he does. And this is the thing about this relatively passive formation, and also matching up versus the opposition in terms of the shape. You're very much reliant on players having superior quality 1 versus 1 over the pitch. Bailly, in this case, was let down by that poor touch, which was one of the aspects that led to the goal. The final point that we're going to make here today is around the role of Ronaldo from a defensive point of view. What he does here is he takes it upon himself to pressure the goalkeeper to try and force an error, which is fine to an extent, but when it's not backed up by your teammates and as part of the overall strategy, it's going to lead to gaps in the back, because as we'll see here, Burnley are relatively able to play the ball under not a huge amount of pressure. What we can see really clearly through this picture is just the absence of Ronaldo. Where is he? So he's put the effort into chasing down the ball, but not put the effort into supporting his teammates, in this case in particular Cavani and Sancho, who are matching up versus three Burnley players. And what we're going to now see is that there was the potential. It didn't result in a goal-scoring opportunity, but because they're overloaded in that middle part of the field, then gaps start to appear, is the point. So Shaw is drawn slightly out of position because he needs to put pressure on the ball, whereas normally perhaps Sancho would have covered that, and that's opening up gaps in the channel, which the Burnley players could have looked to exploit. McNeil, on this occasion, although technically he's a very excellent player and he looked good in this particular match, he wasn't able to find that pass. But it just points out a general point, which is around if you're playing in a particular defensive structure, if you have players doing their own thing as part of that, even where they're putting, in this case Ronaldo, quite a lot of effort into closing down the goalkeeper, it creates a knock-on effect, which could, as I say, lead to a goal-scoring chance for Burnley. So what we've seen here, which I think is really interesting, is a surprising degree of tactical flexibility shown by Ralf Rangnick, and it could provide a clue that he's not necessarily going to be dogmatic about how he sets up his teams. If you like this video, please express that by hitting the like button while you're there. Please subscribe and drop me a comment and I'll get back to you, and we will see you next time.